Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at how to use a webcam, there I am right there, and Optical Flow to basically track movement and use movement as a trigger. There are many different ways you can do this and ways that you can use the output from Optical Flow. In this case, we're just going to go with one of the more simple forms and kind of how to get useful information out of Optical Flow. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. Okay, so I've got this new project open. We can just go ahead and hold down Shift, click and drag to select everything that's in here and just delete it all. All right, so to get started, we're going to need to use our webcam, right? Or whatever video device we would like to use. We're going to set this to video device in. And I'm going to double click and drop that there. It should activate and work as long as you aren't using your camera for some other device or for some other setting. Everything should be running. Once you get the camera running, the next step is to pull up the Optical Flow. Now, Optical Flow is not an operator that's in this menu. It's in the palette, which is on this side of the screen. If, for some reason, the palette is not open, there is the second from the left icon up here is Open Palette, and you can click that, and it will pop open. Within the palette, there are a bunch of different options here, Optical Flow is under the Tools tab, and if we go down, you can see here is Optical Flow, and all you do is you click and drag this out here. Now, what Optical Flow is it's not really an operator. It's called they call it a .tox file, but it's basically a little nested loop. You can actually see, if I zoom in here, and you might not be able to see this on your screen, but there's actually a circle that's moving around. And if I pop in here and actually fly into this, you'll see there's that circle that's moving around. And that's just sort of the default thing, is that they've got some noise on an X and Y coordinate here, and that's controlling the X and Y position of this circle, so it's randomly moving around the screen. One of the other tutorials I want to do is kind of like an introduction to noise and how to use noise to do different types of control. This is a great example. What's nice is you can copy this entire patch and be like, oh, I want to do that with some other element, and you can do it. But so we've got, so what this is going to do is we're going to be piping in our video stream. And what happens is you can kind of see it's a little bit hard to see right now, but you can see that there's like red if it's moving in one direction, and it kind of goes yellow, and then green if it's moving in the other direction. And that's basically what this does, is if you're moving from right to left, then what it does is it's going to be catching the edge of that object and turning it red and saying, hey, motion's happening in this way. If it's moving the other way, you tend to get green. And again, there's the X and Y coordinates, right? It can be moving up in, it can be moving in the red direction in the Y and the green direction in the X, or vice versa, or, some combination thereof. So, and what all it's really doing is it's taking and it's looking at the previous frame, so I've connected this now. It's looking at the previous frame of your video source and comparing it to the current frame. And then it's determining like how much motion has there been between those two frames. And so that's pretty awesome, right? You can kind of see if you waver your hand or something in front of here, you'll be able to see some changes. And if we select the Optical Flow, you'll see in the parameters menu over here, we have this force option, offset, lambda, threshold, and then we can basically flip the direction of one of the axes if we need to. And so I'm going to leave all that at the default for now, but I just wanted to show you some of the things that make changes, right? So force, if I increase the force, it basically makes the green and red brighter, right? And then this threshold value, these are the two kind of most important-ish. The threshold value says, like, what's the minimum amount of movement that's going to be required to trigger this thing to go off? And so right now, any movement, like if even little subtle vibrations of my hand are being picked up, and that's going to be pretty noisy, it's going to be jittery, right, is what it's going to look like in the data. And so if I pull the threshold up, then there's some point where a certain amount of motion isn't going to be detected. But if I go a little bit, if I move a little bit more, you can kind of see that motion actually happening. And so you sort of just have to test and see, like, you know, how much of the plane needs to be adjusted. And you can see it's pretty sensitive, right? So, you know, it's something you just have to sort of test and see, like, you know, what's going to work for your use case. Lambda is a little bit more complex. We're not going to talk about that too much right now. It's something that you may need to adjust to, like, clean things up a little bit more. And then offset also kind of adjusts kind of the intensity of, or the center point of the motion, if that makes sense. So it determines at what point of motion does it go from being red to being green. And that's 3 is sort of the default for that. So I'm going to leave that there. I am going to leave the force set at 2 for our use right now. You can, this is the end of the slider, but you can blast that up significantly higher if you need to. Okay, so we've got our optical flow device. So how do we use this information? The first thing we want to do is we want to be able to get that red and green value out of this operator. And that's going to be a little bit tricky because and we want to be able to make it a top, because what we're going to be using is we're basically going to be turning this into a trigger to switch video sources in this example. And so we need to use an operator under the chops that is called top2, which basically is going to take a top and turn it into a chop. And to do that, we can't connect purple to green. That doesn't work. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to take this operator and drag this up and drop it in here and release it. And you'll note that that did not work at all, right? And that's because, right, this isn't a typical operator. And so that form isn't going to work. Now, we could... there is a way we can actually reference one of the operators in here and put it here, but it's oftentimes just easier to use a null. And so all we do is if we right-click on this output port and go to null, and then drop this down here. Now, whatever is coming out of optical flow is going to go into this null. It should be exactly identical. Now, one thing you might want to do is that we might want to go on our null and go to the common. And actually, that's locked out. We're going to leave it like this and hope for the best. There's times when you want more color information. In this case, I think it's probably fine. And it is probably just matching whatever's being output. Okay, so we've got our null. So now let's go ahead and see if we can get this null into our top. So what we're going to do is we're just going to select the top. We're going to click drag our null 1 up into this field. As soon as we do that, I want you to note that we get these 4 lines of information, R, G, B, and A, right? A is alpha, B is blue. It's kind of funny that red and green are yellow and red, you know, and blue is it, but it doesn't really matter. But you can see that as I'm moving, I'm getting changes in the red and green values, right? Which is exactly what we would expect to have happen. And you can see it's pretty twitchy right now. I might need to make some adjustments to make that a little cleaner. And I may want to actually have my threshold, let's see here. I have the threshold at 1.42. I'm going to set that to 0 for now, just because then we're definitely getting information all the time. Granted, it's going to be a lot, but we get something all the time. Okay, so we've got this information starting to be put into a format that we can actually use. Okay, so the next step is we're going to run this into a math operator. And we're doing this because we're going to be splitting things out from here, and it's just a lot easier to route this if we do this ahead of time. We may not need this math operator, but if we want to adjust the range or sensitivity or change some things globally for both the red and green values, this is the place that we want to do it before we start selecting each individual channel and taking our chains to set our triggers. And so I'm going to go ahead and create this math object operator, and it's going to look exactly the same. It's not doing anything at all. We're not going to make any changes to any of these values, but this will allow us to adjust our range if needed, or multiply it, make the values just larger in general. Okay, so we've got that set. So let's go ahead and do the next step. So the next step, and we could do this in two ways. We're going to split it out now, and then actually, yeah, because that gives us a little bit more control, I think, later on. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click, and we're going to go and we're going to create a select operator, which if we can't find it, oh, yeah, we need to type in SEL. There we go, select. All right, so I've got one select. And then I can just go ahead and copy and paste this. And what's nice is it's going to already be connected, right? So I've got my two things, but right now it's selecting all of them. And so if we look up, I'm going to go to select one first. If we look up here, you can see that it says chops. We don't need to really define that. It already knows it's connected. But then channel names star. Star in a lot of programming languages means like everything, right? It means anything in this that's part of this chop, every single channel is going to be selected currently. What we want to do though is we just want to, we're splitting this into two chains and we're just going to have one be R and one be G. So what I can do is I can just go down to here and I can just say R and then rename from, if I basically, all I had to do was click in another one of these fields and then it updated, right? I didn't actually make any changes here, but until I do that or maybe hit enter or return, it doesn't do that. So, right, so I have my red value. And then if I go to select two, I'm going to go ahead and delete that star. I'm going to put in G, right? And the reason for this, and then right now I have to click somewhere else and there we go. The reason for this, right, and the reason I'm using these things is because, right, these are the names of the different channels, R and G, that we are using, red and green. And so we have R up here and we have G here. Now, if I wanted this to be more clear, I could change this to select R and double click down here and change the name of this one to select G, right? That's not necessary, but it might make it easier when we're looking through and figuring out like which one, because they're both colored red, which one of these is actually red and green without having to zoom in on the R and the G. Okay, once we've split this out, we're going to start doing the next steps that we need to do to be able to create this trigger. So it'd be nice if we could just run this select straight into a trigger operator. However, we need to do an intermediary step. We need to analyze this signal and take essentially one value out of it. So we're going to right click on here and we're going to go up to analyze. It's the second one down on the left. And I'm going to go ahead and drop this on here. And you're going to see, right, I'm getting all sorts of really jittery things. You can see as I go, right, forward and back, I get, you know, the bigger the motion I have here to some degree. And especially if I move at just the right rate, I get like a pretty big motion there. But what it's doing is it's analyzing all of this information and it's averaging it, right? And so that's creating this really jittery signal right now. If I click on this function, there's a whole bunch of different options here, right? If you are familiar with audio stuff at all, RMS power is basically like most of the time when you see like a waveform on an equalizer or whatever, that's RMS. Speakers are measured in terms of like, you know, how much power they can handle, you know, things like that, although this is a little bit different than that. But if we click on some of these other ones, right, if we click on sum, right, we're actually getting like a slightly different result, right? We're getting the sum of these different values across whatever, you know, spectrum there is there. If we go to value of last peak, right, you can see we're getting like a much littler blip. Sometimes the scaling on this stuff gets really weird, but we are actually getting something going on there. The one that we want to use, if I remember correctly, is going to be sum. Right? It seems to work pretty well. We get a good result. And you can see already, right, that like, because I have so much activity happening in here, I'm getting a really jittery signal. But that is fine because we're going to be using, in the next step, we're actually going to be kind of eliminating things by using a threshold. And so the next step in this is to use a trigger. So if I go ahead and right click on that output and go over here to trigger, and drop this in, you'll see that, right, it is currently kind of hanging out. If I move my mouth, I actually am triggering the motion sensor on this, right? But if I hold really still, even if I hold still, there's too much sensitivity, right? So what we need to do is we need to look at some of these settings and see if we can fix it here first, and then if we need to, we can adjust some things in our optical flow as well. So this trigger is not just a switch that's on and off. It can be, but it also has attack, sustain, delay, and release, decay and release. And if you're not familiar with what an ASDR envelope is it's basically, it says some event happens, and then we're going to go from 0 to 100% power, or whatever we set it at, over a certain amount of time. That's the attack. And so in audio, it's really obvious if you have like something very percussive that say you hit a drum head or something like that, the attack is incredibly short on that. But if you have, say, some really floaty, spacey synth sounds, usually those have a really long attack. So it very slowly increases in volume until it peaks out, and then usually there's a slow decay after that. Sometimes it's all attack, and then there's a sudden drop or decay that just cuts off, right? And so this trigger allows us to have a lot of different means of control here. The first thing we want to set is going to be our trigger threshold, right? That's sort of like, what's the minimum value required to trigger this? And so I'm going to go ahead and pull this up until I get it so that no matter what I do, I'm not, oh, this is actually pretty good. With my settings, 1.94 seems to be enough where I can actually move and trigger it, but then none of the noise down here is triggering it, right? It's only when I'm making a certain amount of movement. Now, the other thing that's happening here, I think, is, yeah, if I bump my table at all, I'm going to be triggering this thing because it's a wiggly table. So that's just something to note if you see this continuing to go. But what's nice about this is, right, my trigger is currently set to 1.94. That's working for my camera, my input, my wiggly table. You may not need it to be this high. If for some reason you're up here and like you're not getting any results in your trigger at all you do is you basically just keep going down until it starts to trigger. And then you start moving around and be like, okay, this is a good amount of sensitivity, right? It's not going off all the time. It's only going off when there's movements of a certain size or intensity that happen. So that's the first value we want. And for me, 1.82 works fine. I could go a little lower maybe and have it be a bit more sensitive if I wanted to, but that's fine. So there's also this re-trigger delay. What this sets is basically how soon after this has been triggered can it be triggered again, right? So sometimes like maybe you have this set so that maybe you're using optical flow as your sensor for like a bump sensor, where if somebody bumps into something, it shakes the camera, that triggers motion, and then it makes something move and the camera sees that, and then that's the threshold. But you don't want it to like, if somebody double taps it, you want it to be, you just want it to be one trigger, right? And the minimum trigger length is basically how long does this value does the value coming into this need to be above the threshold in order for it to activate the trigger, right? And so in our case, 0 is totally fine, right? We could, if you wanted to be like, oh, somebody needs to be like doing a really sustained motion in order for this to trigger, that's another possibility as well, right? But we're going to just leave it there. And then this trigger on, the increasing values, basically, is this going from like no motion to motion is what we're triggering on. But if we click on this, you can see we can also do decreasing values. So we could say, you could be triggering something to happen as someone's becoming more calm or still, right? Or there's no, like if it's going from motion to no motion, then maybe that's the actual trigger, right? So you have the ability to do both of those things. Multi-trigger, right? This is a little bit more advanced, but basically, right, if basically what it's saying is like if you're getting multiple trigger inputs that meet this threshold, you can just ignore them during the attack, which is the default behavior. You can add on to it so they do multiple triggers, or you can actually have it just restart the envelope, which basically means, right, the ASDR envelope starts, and we're going to look at that in a second, but it starts at some point. It takes a certain amount of time to complete. And so you can basically hop immediately back to 0 and restart that envelope. It depends on what you're trying to do. Each one's going to have a different result. In our case, we're going to leave this. We'll leave the clamp at peak level. You can actually trigger, like, fire off a pulse this way. So if I click that button, it's going to trigger it. And that's for testing. And then the update once per cycle, we're going to leave that off, and we're just going to leave the complete trigger and leave all of that the same. So if we go to the attack tab, you can have a delay set is the first thing. So you can say maybe the trigger happens and then it takes half a second before the envelope starts doing its thing. The attack length by default is 0.2 of a second. The attack shape is ease in, ease out. This is sort of like a curve, so it like slowly ramps up into motion, and then the curve steepens, and then as it gets towards the top, it kind of rolls off again and slows down before stopping, right? You can also do linear, which is basically like it just moves at the same rate from start to from the bottom to the top of the envelope, and then the same rate back down, right? And so the default is this. It typically is the smoothest. It looks the nicest for video and things like that too. Peak level is set to 1. That's great. That's all we're going to want to use right now. We can adjust that, and there's reasons you might want to for a variety of things. And then peak length, basically how long should this be at 100% of whatever we're doing. In our case, we're going to be using it to switch between two video sources, or to do a crossfade between two different video sources. And so we can say how long do we want it to be video source 2 before it rolls back down to video source 1. And so we're going to leave these settings alone now. And then the sustain is similar. And so what we can do is if we, to see kind of what this looks like, we can create a chop called trail. And I'm going to go ahead and connect this, and you just connect this to the very top inlet. And you'll see what it's doing, right? So if I make a movement, and you'll see I did trigger 2 lumps there. But what it's doing is this waveform. I love that the R rolls over the waveform. It makes me so happy. But what's this doing is that's the attack, that's the sustain, or that's the peak. And then you'll see it drops down, hangs out for just a little second at like this little elbow thing here, and then it drops the rest of the way down. So what's happening on that side is what we need to look at. So what happens on that side is under this sustain tag. So decay is this little drop down from the peak. And then the sustain level, 0.5, is right here. You can see it's right at 0.5. And then the minimum sustain length is currently 0. So it pretty quickly drops down into the release, right? So the decay, especially for sound, decay makes a lot of sense. And for video, in this case, we're going to do this so we actually have it hang out halfway between, like mixing the two videos for a little bit, and then it's going to drop the rest of the way down. So we'll set this minimum sustain length. Let's go ahead and set it to like half a second. Right, so now what it's going to do, right, you can see how now whenever I make a movement, right, it goes and it hangs out for a bit at that middle point, and then it drops back down. So let's go ahead and actually use some of this information and data. Now we also have this release length of 0.3. We're going to set that to be longer here in a little bit. So in order to use this, let's create 2 movie in files, or 2 movie in tops. So I'm just going to say top movie file in, and yeah, we're gonna use the banana, and then let's just go ahead and copy and paste this. And for movie file in 2, if we hit the plus sign, we can just use one of the default things. I'm going to go ahead and go with one of these butterflies. You can choose whatever the heck you want. They could be video. you know, we could do the count video, but I'm just going to go ahead and do 2 static images. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to change the functionality at all. And then we need one more top called a cross, which is a cross fade between these 2 videos. So we're going to double click again, go over here to cross, wherever you are, there you are. And we're going to go ahead and connect one of these into the first inlet and this other one into the second inlet. And you'll see by default, it is set to 0.5. There's only one parameter here, and we can basically, right, drag this slider back and forth between these 2 things. Now, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this trigger in order to do that thing. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and make this viewer active. We're going to click and drag this over here, and we're going to say export chop. And now, if I make this the background, when I move, right, I'm getting these changes, and you'll see it's like pausing there in the middle, kind of statically, halfway between, and then it drops back down to the banana. Right? Every time I move a little bit, right, we're getting this motion. So let's see what happens when we increase the length, and we'll have to undo that viewer active and to select this. And then we're going to go ahead and let's increase this length to, I don't know, let's just make it the full thing right now. Right, so you can see, right, and I'm stopping talking because it seems like talking is hard to do without moving. And so it's twitching back and forth. But right, so now there's a much longer fade. So now I could say, oh, well, maybe I want that decay to halfway down to be longer as well. Maybe we need to set that to like, maybe that's like a second in length or something like that. Right, so let's see if we, right, so now we're getting that. Now, in my case, you know, I don't necessarily probably want this sustain level to be there for like a minimum of 5. It just seems like kind of laggy and static. If it was 2 video sources, it might make more sense, but let's go ahead and just leave it. Let's have a little bit of a hump in there, but not too much. Right, so you can see we've got, oh, oops, I set the sustain level. Let's set the sustain level to 0.5. So the sustain level, right, is going to set where in here or where in here between 0 and 1 we have our blending happening. What I meant to do was reduce the sustain length down. So it's a little bit, there's maybe like a little pause and then it drops down, right? Okay, so now, right, with our trigger, the other thing is I'd like this to not be triggering quite so frequently. Like I'd like to have it actually, you know, flow through here for a little bit longer. So let's go ahead and add some retrigger delay. I'm going to start with setting it to a second. All right, so now I can, as over that second I can move, you can see it's already, right, it is re-triggering because, right, that's even a little bit too short. You may, if you want this, right, to only re-trigger only to actually play all the way out before it can be re-triggered again, then you would want to kind of add up your length of things and set it in here, right? So if I know my attack is 0.2 and my peak length is 0.1, so that's 0.3, and then 1.3 plus 0.1 is 1.4 plus 2 is 3.4. So I could come in here and I could say, okay, this should be actually, right, 3.4 seconds. Right, and so now I can move around a whole lot, and I shouldn't be able to do anything until, right, it gets through that cycle. So that's how trigger works, right? So we can do this trigger. Now we have these 2 axes of movement, and so we could potentially, right, do this same set of things to control something else. And so if you would like to, you could split out, you could go and basically do these same steps, right? Create the analyze, create the trigger. You could have a trail on there so you can kind of see, right, how the trigger is being used. But then you can connect this to whatever value you want, right? This is a value between 0 and 1. And so let's say that we want to, and we're going to use the same one. We're not going to use the other axis of motion right now. But let's say we want to be able to like fade through a range of colors. And maybe that's a tint that's going to be applied to this. Let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to go ahead and create a constant. And a constant is basically just a color. So let's set it to something that's like 100% red, right? Saturation 1, value 1, hue is 359. And what we're going to do is then we're going to feed this into a HSV Adjust. So we right click on here, we're going to go to HSV Adjust. And then, right, if you remember, this operator allows us to basically, with the hue offset, right, we can slide through all of these values. But hue offset goes from -360 to +360. So let's go ahead and we might as well go ahead and use our green channel. So I'm going to hold down, I'm going to select my analyze, grab the trigger and grab this trail. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this. But then I'm going to feed in the, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I do want you to note what just happened, right? If I have all three of these selected and I connect this here, it's actually going to connect it to every one of these values, which could be really useful sometimes, but not this time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click so I have those deselected. Now I should be able to just feed that in there. Okay. So now we should have our up and down motion. You'll notice things are a little bit different, right? It's not exactly moving in the same rate, but those settings and values are the same. So the one thing we do need to add here is we're going to need to use a math operator to increase the range. I'm going to move my network around just a little bit here to make this a little bit less obnoxious. And I'm going to temporarily turn off my banana there. And I'm just going to, oof, that is a lot. I'm going to turn that off too. That was too much for my eyes. Okay, so we've got this trigger set. The one thing we need to do is we need to then take this from 0 to 1, and we need to make that value into -360 to +360. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just double click off here. I'm going to go to CHOP, and I am going to use a math op and drop this down here for now, connect this into the math, select the math, and I'm going to go to range, and the from range is 0 to 1. The to range is going to be -360 to +360. And so you'll see right now I'm getting values that go to -360 and jump back up to +360. It's going to be a little flickery, but it's not, but it should be reasonably smooth. So if I go ahead and go into this here and I make this viewer active, click and drag and drop this in this value, and I can either do a CHOP reference or export CHOP, right? And so now you can see I've got this HSV adjust that anytime I move, it's going to be triggering across this entire range. And you'll see it very quickly goes up the chain. And that's not exactly what I want in this case, right? So let's go ahead and select our trigger 2. And we're going to actually increase our attack length because that's a lot. And if you suffer from epilepsy, or if you have people that are seeing this that suffer from epilepsy, that could be very problematic. So let's go ahead and increase our attack length to 2. And so now what it's going to do is it's going to, right, much more slowly fade between these values. Now, the other thing is we probably, since we increased this to 2, we probably want to go to our retrigger delay and add, we're going to just add straight up 2 onto this. So it's going to be 5.4. We could probably do 5.2 because we are essentially subtracting 0.2. It doesn't really matter for this example, but that should mean that as it goes up and down, it should be, right, a much smoother transition. Okay, so now what we could do is we could say, okay, well, let's blend these two outputs together and see what happens. So we're going to use a composite to do this, because then we can have, so we're going to go to top and composite, because then we can do fun different blending modes and see what happens. So we've got these two things connected, and you can see already it's basically in its default multiply state. It's creating like a really vibrantly rainbow colored banana and butterfly. We can, right, but again, we could do any one of these. If we want something really crazy, we could probably say difference, right? And we're going to get something that, again, is a little flickery and insane. But right, our motion is, right, both causing the trigger between the two things to move, and we're getting that color change, right? I'm going to go back to multiply because it's a lot less intense to watch. Negate might honestly be interesting too, although that's pretty punchy. Yeah, we could look at a couple, right, different examples. These different blend modes, allow you to do a lot of different different things. Subtract might be interesting. Looks like it does some things. Outside luminance is really, oh, that was over. That's never going to work. Outside, right? It's just going to do something interesting. We could have another video source that we put under there that goes through that transparency, right? There's lots of things we could do from here to create interesting effects. I'm going to go back to multiply because it's more pleasant to look at. And yeah, so that's the end of this tutorial, right? So that's a way that we can use optical flow to pretty quickly create a usable value in order to control different parameters over time.